The storm came without much warning, the way most things in Greystone Crossing did. One moment the sky above the timber ridges was the color of old pewter, and the next it split open. Rain driving sideways across the single road that ran through town, bending the lantern flames inside their glass cages and sending loose shingles skittering off rooftops like frightened birds. Evelyn had seen plenty of storms in her 28 years. She had learned not to wait on anyone to help her board the shutters. She did it herself, same as everything else. She was pulling the last one closed when she heard the horse. Not the sound of a rider coming in steady. It was the other kind. The panicked clatter of hooves losing purchase on wet ground, a sharp whinny cutting through the rain, and then a heavy silence that somehow felt louder than all the noise before it. Evelyn stood at her window for exactly 3 seconds. Then she grabbed her coat. He was lying at the edge of her small front yard, face down in the mud, one boot still caught in the stirrup of a horse that had long since bolted into the dark. She didn't stop to think about whether it was wise to approach a stranger in the middle of the night. There wasn't time for wise. There was only the rain and the man, and the fact that he wasn't moving. She knelt beside him and pressed 2 fingers to the side of his neck. A pulse. Slow, but there. Getting him inside took everything she had. He was tall and broad-shouldered, built like a man who had spent his life doing hard work under an open sky, and he was completely dead weight. She dragged him more than carried him, her boot slipping twice on the porch steps, her breath coming in short, hard pulls. By the time she had him on the floor near the stove, she was soaked through to her skin, and her arms were trembling. She pushed the wet hair back from his face and got her first real look at him. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, she guessed. Strong jaw, dark brows, a few days of beard growth across his chin. There was a gash above his left temple where he had clearly struck something when he fell. A rock, most likely, or the edge of a stirrup iron. The blood had already mixed with rainwater and was running in a thin pink line down the side of his face. His clothes were well made. She noticed that without meaning to. Not the rough canvas and worn leather of a drifter. The fabric was quality, the stitching clean. But he carried nothing with him. No saddlebag, no coat, no papers. Nothing that told her who he was. Evelyn fetched her medical kit from the shelf above the wash basin, the one she kept stocked because Greystone Crossing had no doctor within 40 miles, and her students had a reliable talent for splitting their heads open on the schoolyard fence. She cleaned the wound at his temple carefully, stitched it with the same steady hands she used to write lesson plans, and wrapped it in clean linen. Then she covered him with the heaviest quilt she owned, and sat back on her heels and looked at him. Outside, the storm pressed against the walls of her small house like it wanted in. She had lived in Greystone Crossing for 6 years. She had come here at 22 with a teaching certificate, a single trunk of belongings, and the quiet understanding that she was entirely on her own. There had been no inheritance waiting, no family home to return to, no one who would have noticed particularly if she had simply disappeared. She had built what she had, the house, the reputation, the small, careful life, from nothing but her own determination. The people of Greystone Crossing respected her for it mostly. Some of the women found her independence unsettling, in the way that things tend to unsettle people when they quietly challenge what's expected. She didn't mind. She had stopped minding a long time ago. But sitting here now, watching the chest of a stranger rise and fall in the firelight, she felt something she hadn't felt in longer than she could honestly remember. Curiosity. Not the ordinary kind. Not the small-town hunger for gossip that passed through Greystone Crossing like weather. Something quieter than that. Something that had nothing to do with who he was or where he'd come from, and everything to do with the particular way he was frowning even in unconsciousness, as if whatever he was dreaming about refused to give him any peace. She made herself a cup of tea she didn't drink and stayed near the stove until past midnight. He didn't wake. But somewhere around the third hour, the frown eased. His breathing steadied and deepened, and the lines across his forehead smoothed out until he looked, for just a moment, like a man who had finally put something down that he'd been carrying for a very long time. Evelyn didn't know why that made her chest feel tight. She told herself it was the cold. She told herself she would know his name by morning, and that would be the end of the mystery, and she would go back to her ordinary life without a second thought. But morning came gray and quiet over Greystone Crossing, the storm blown through and the timber ridges dripping silver in the early light. And when the man finally opened his eyes and looked at her from across the room, he didn't say his name. He just looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. And then he said the last thing she expected. "You shouldn't have brought me in." Evelyn set down the cup she was holding with a quiet, deliberate click against the wooden table. "Good morning to you too," she said. He pushed himself upright slowly, one hand braced against the floor, the other moving instinctively to the bandage at his temple. He touched it with 2 fingers, not pulling at it, just registering that it was there. Then he looked around the room the way a man does when he's trying to piece together time he's lost, taking in the stove, the bookshelves, the small window with its view of the mud-soaked road outside. His eyes came back to her. "How long?" he asked. "Since last night," she said. "Just past the 9th hour, I'd estimate. The storm brought you down about 10 yards from my front gate." He said nothing to that, just nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something to himself rather than responding to her. Evelyn pulled a chair from the table and sat down across from him, with the particular patience she had developed over years of waiting for children to admit what they'd done wrong. "I'll ask you plainly," she said. "Are you in any kind of trouble that's going to find its way to my door?" Something shifted in his expression. Not quite amusement, but close to it. "No," he said. "Nothing like that." "Then you're welcome to stay until you're steady on your feet." She stood and moved toward the stove. "And you can start by telling me your name." There was a pause, just a breath too long. "Alistair," he said. She waited. He didn't offer anything more. She ladled broth into a bowl without turning around, and chose not to push. A man who paused before giving his own first name was either hiding something or carrying something, and neither one was a conversation that went well before breakfast. He stayed 3 days. The head wound was worse than it looked, which Evelyn had suspected. The second morning he tried to stand, and made it as far as the doorframe, before the room tilted badly enough that he had to grip the wood with both hands and wait for the world to settle. She watched him from the kitchen without comment, and set a glass of water on the table where he could reach it when he was ready to admit defeat. He was not an easy patient. He wasn't demanding. She could have managed demanding. He was something harder to deal with. He was quiet in a way that took up space, the kind of quiet that made a room feel smaller without anything being said. He watched things carefully, the way the light fell through the windows in the afternoon, the row of books along her shelf, the stack of student compositions she graded in the evenings, her pen moving steadily across the pages while the fire burned low. Once, she looked up and found him watching her work with an expression she couldn't name. "Do you read?" she asked. "Some," he said. She pulled a book from the shelf without asking what he preferred, and set it beside him. He picked it up, looked at the cover, and a faint smile crossed his face so briefly she almost missed it. She had chosen without thinking, a collection of frontier surveys and land records she used for her geography lessons, not exactly leisure reading. "Occupational habit," she said, a little embarrassed. "It's fine," he said. and he opened it and actually read it, which she found both puzzling and oddly endearing. On the second evening, the trouble came to her door in the form of Gerald Hobbs. Gerald ran the largest timber operation on the east side of Greystone Crossing and had made an art form out of believing that his money entitled him to opinions about other people's choices. He was not a violent man, but he was a persistent one, and he had decided some months ago that Evelyn's little house on the edge of town would make a fine addition to the land he was quietly assembling along the northern road. She had told him no 3 times already. Each time he found a new angle. He knocked with the particular authority of a man who expected doors to open for him, and when Evelyn answered, she saw his eyes move immediately past her shoulder to where Alistair sat near the stove, the land survey book open across his knee. Gerald's expression tightened. "Didn't realize you had company, Evelyn." "I don't, particularly," she said. "Is there something you needed, Mr. Hobbs?" His eyes didn't leave Alistair. "Passing through?" he asked, directing the question over her head. Alistair looked up from the book with a calm that seemed almost studied. "For now," he said pleasantly. Gerald looked back at Evelyn. Something in his manner had shifted slightly. She couldn't quite put her finger on why. "I'll come back another time," he said, and left without making his usual speech about the property. Evelyn closed the door and stood with her back to it for a moment. "Friend of yours?" Alistair asked. "The opposite," she said. He looked back down at the book. "He won't bother you again tonight," he said, with the quiet certainty of a man stating the weather. She wanted to ask him what he meant by that. She wanted to ask him quite a few things, actually. Why he had paused before giving his name. Why his clothes were too fine for the road he'd apparently been traveling. Why a man with no saddlebag and no papers still somehow carried himself like he owned the ground he stood on. But something stopped her each time. Not politeness exactly, more the instinct that some answers change things, and that some things, once changed, don't go back. On the 3rd morning, he was well enough to leave. She could see it in the way he moved, steadier, the careful deliberateness of someone managing pain, replaced by something more natural. He stood at the window after breakfast, looking out at the road, with his hands loose at his sides, and Evelyn recognized the posture. She had seen it in her students when a school day was ending, and they were already halfway out the door in their minds. She was at the wash basin when he spoke. "I owe you more than I can settle right now," he said. "You don't owe me anything," she said, without turning around. "Evelyn." It was the first time he had used her name. She had told it to him on the first morning, matter-of-factly, the way she told most things. But hearing it now in his voice, quiet and deliberate, made her hands go still in the water. She turned around. He was looking at her with that same unreadable expression from the first morning, but something in it had opened slightly, the way a window opens just enough to let the air change in a room. "I'll be back through Greystone Crossing," he said, "before the month is out." She held his gaze for a moment. "People say that," she said carefully. "I know they do," he said, and he picked up his hat from the table and walked out into the pale morning without another word, leaving her standing in her kitchen with soapy hands and the strange, unwelcome feeling that the house was considerably quieter than it had been 3 days ago. She told herself that meant nothing. She told herself that for 11 days straight. On the 12th day, she stopped telling herself anything, because that was the morning she walked into town for supplies and found out exactly who Alistair was, and the ground shifted under her feet in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. She heard it at Calloway's general store, the way most things got heard in Greystone Crossing, sideways, between 2 people who weren't talking to her. Margaret Surrency and her sister were at the dry goods counter, debating the price of flour. When Margaret lowered her voice in that particular way, that meant the conversation had just become interesting. Evelyn was 2 aisles over, her basket on her arm, not meaning to listen. "Thornwell's men were back at the land office yesterday," Margaret said. "All 3 of them, filing papers on the Hobbs timber lots." Her sister made a sound of disbelief. "Gerald sold?" "Didn't have much choice from what I heard. Thornwell owns the water rights on that entire northern stretch. Gerald could have held on another season maybe, 2 at the outside. So he took the offer." Margaret shook her head slowly. "That family has owned more of this county than most people realize. Alistair Thornwell especially. Quiet about it, which makes it worse somehow." Evelyn's basket handle creaked under her grip. She set it down on the shelf beside her very carefully and stood perfectly still for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. Alistair Thornwell. The name connected to the face with a clarity that felt almost physical. The quality of his clothes, the steadiness of his hands, the way Gerald Hobbs had looked at him across her small room and decided without a word being exchanged that today was not the day. The land survey book she had handed him as an afterthought, and he had read without blinking. She picked up her basket and finished her shopping and walked home in the thin autumn sunlight and did not allow herself to feel anything about it until she was inside with the door closed. Then she sat down at her kitchen table and felt quite a lot. It wasn't the money that unsettled her. She needed to be honest with herself about that. She had never particularly wanted money, had never built her life around the idea of it, and the presence or absence of it in someone else's pocket changed nothing about who they were when they sat near her stove and read land surveys with a small, reluctant smile. What unsettled her was the silence. 3 days in her home. 3 days of quiet conversation and shared meals, and the particular intimacy of caring for someone who is briefly helpless. And he had never once said his last name, had let her believe he was simply a man passing through, no more and no less, when the truth was that the ground she walked to school on every morning likely had his family's name attached to some deed in a courthouse drawer. She understood why, perhaps. Men of that kind learned quickly that their name changed how people treated them, that the moment it was known, something shifted, the warmth becoming performance, the simplicity becoming impossible. She understood it. That didn't mean it sat easily. He came back on the 14th day, not the 12th as she had half expected, and 3/4 hoped. She was in the schoolyard after the children had gone, stacking the split wood that kept the classroom warm through the afternoon sessions, when she heard a horse on the road and looked up, and there he was. No mistaking the way he sat a horse, straight but not rigid, like a man comfortable in his own bones. He dismounted at the gate and stood there for a moment, hat in hand, which told her something. She went back to stacking wood. "You could have told me," she said, when she heard his boots on the ground behind her. "I know," he said. "I would have treated you exactly the same. I know that too," he said quietly. "That's not why I didn't tell you." She stopped and turned around. He was closer than she'd realized, standing just at the edge of the shadow the schoolhouse threw across the yard, and he was looking at her with an expression she finally had a word for. It was the look of a man who had spent a long time being known for what he owned, and was not entirely sure how to exist in front of someone who had known him before any of that entered the room. "Then why?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, not the evasive quiet of the first morning, something more careful than that. "Because for 3 days," he said, "I was just a man with a headache sitting near someone's fire, and I couldn't remember the last time that was true." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. The autumn wind moved through the schoolyard, lifting a few dead leaves off the ground and carrying them past his boots. "That's a fairly honest answer," she said finally. "I'm working on being more honest," he said. There was something in his voice that was almost a question. She turned back to the woodpile. "You can start by helping me finish stacking this," she said. "And then you can walk me home and tell me something true about yourself every 100 yards. She heard him set his hat on the fence post. Then he came and picked up a log and stacked it without another word, and something about the ease of it, the simple willingness of it, settled something in her chest that had been unsettled for 14 days. It was not a swift thing, what grew between them. Nothing real ever is. He came back to Greystone Crossing 7 more times before the first snow fell, and each time he stayed a little longer. He met her students, who regarded him with the frank, evaluating stare that only children and animals can pull off without offense. He sat through 2 town meetings and said almost nothing and listened to everything. He fixed the broken step on her porch one afternoon without asking, and she pretended not to notice, and then thanked him for it. Over supper, and he pretended to be surprised that she had seen. Gerald Hobbs left Greystone Crossing in November, which simplified several things. In December, Alistair asked her a question while they were walking the northern road after a light snowfall, the timber ridges white against a pale sky. He asked it plainly and without decoration, the way she had come to understand he did most things that mattered to him. She stopped walking. She looked at him standing there in the snow with his hat in his hand again. He had a habit of doing that, she had noticed, removing it when something was important, as if he wanted nothing between him and the truth of a moment. "You're asking me?" she said slowly. "Even though you know I have nothing." "You have everything," he said. "I've seen how you built it." It was the right answer. She wasn't entirely sure he knew how right it was, which made it more right somehow. "Yes," she said, just the one word. But she said it looking straight at him, the way she did most things, and he heard everything inside it. They were married in the spring, in the small church at the edge of Greystone Crossing, with half the town crowded into the pews, and the other half standing outside the open windows because the building couldn't hold everyone who wanted to come. Evelyn wore a dress the color of cream and carried wildflowers she had picked herself that morning, because that was the kind of woman she was, and no amount of Thornwell money was going to change her particular approach to things. Alistair stood at the front of the church and watched her walk toward him with the expression of a man who still couldn't quite believe his luck, which Evelyn found both touching and faintly ridiculous, given that she was the one who had dragged him out of the mud. She told him so, quietly, as she reached his side. He laughed, a real laugh, unguarded and warm, and the whole church heard it, and several older women in the front pews smiled the particular smile of people watching something that was always going to happen, finally happen. The minister had to ask for quiet, twice. 2 years later, on a warm September evening, Alistair came home from the North Range to find the house smelling of something good on the stove, and Evelyn sitting at the kitchen table with a look on her face that stopped him in the doorway. He read it in approximately 3 seconds. He crossed the room and sat down across from her, and reached for both her hands across the table, and she watched his face move through surprise, and something deeper than surprise, all the way to a quiet and complete joy that she had never seen on another person's face before, and knew she would remember for the rest of her life. Outside, the timber ridges of Greystone Crossing caught the last of the evening light. Inside, 2 people sat across a kitchen table in a small house that one of them had built from nothing, and the world arranged itself around them with the simple, unhurried rightness of things that were always meant to be.